Look closely at how we run the world right now. Our global sciences and governance systems are deeply fragmented. Physics, biology, sociology, and international law all operate in isolated silos, speaking completely different languages. This disconnect carries a massive cost. When disciplines cannot communicate, the systems built on top of them stall. We see this today in international climate treaties that struggle to enforce compliance, and in the ongoing chaotic race to define ethical guardrails for artificial intelligence. To solve this, researchers are searching for a shared grammar. They are looking for a universal blueprint for stability that applies to everything, from the behavior of subatomic quarks to the rise and fall of human civilizations. Finding this blueprint is not an abstract academic exercise. If we fail to integrate these isolated disciplines, the sheer complexity of the modern world will overwhelm our ability to maintain it. In April 2026, an open-source AI project called OpenMythos launched to the public. It introduced a highly complex, multi-agent architecture built entirely around 3 specific functional pillars. Exactly 23 days earlier, a public framework known as U-theory published the exact same architectural scaffold. You might suspect intellectual theft, but the public record shows neither project copied the other. Instead, this is a verified case of independent convergence. Advanced AI engineers are not borrowing theoretical philosophy to build these models. They are independently hitting the hard structural constraints required to make machine intelligence actually function. OpenMythos acts as an early indicator. It proves that as our technology scales, engineers are forced by sheer necessity to adopt the universe's native grammar. U-theory argues that any stable system requires a minimal triad to survive. The first pillar is form, which defines a system's identity and its internal constraints. The second is position, which establishes its spatial context and placement within its environment. This animation illustrates those axes locking into place. The final component is action. It represents the energy expenditure and dynamic behavior that activates the form and the position. When an axis is removed, the geometry doesn't just become fragile, it becomes mathematically undefined. This is triad engineering, the hard limit of what can exist. When you apply this triad to artificial intelligence, the translation is direct. Form becomes objects, position translates to locations, and action maps to dynamic actions. For years, the default method for building better AI was throwing massive amounts of raw computing power at the problem. But raw energy, action, without mathematically sound constraints and optimal resource routing, inevitably leads to instability. This structural limit is exactly why the 3-part architecture of OpenMythos perfectly mirrors the U-theory breakdown. To build a robust intelligence that doesn't hallucinate or collapse under its own compute weight, developers must satisfy all 3 conditions simultaneously. Artificial intelligence is simply the first human technology complex enough to require the universe's fundamental grammar of stability to survive. We see these same structural patterns in high-level human systems. Whether it's a 3-person startup or a nation-state, every organization survives on the same 3 variables: ethical integrity, operational efficiency, and the fulfillment of stakeholder rights. Because these constraints are universal, the minimal triad scales directly from the digital to the social. To test this, researchers developed the U-score, a metric that measures triadic stability across real-world organizations and treaties. This photograph shows world leaders gathered at the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. It serves as a perfect case study of how our traditional, single-issue diplomatic approach attempts to solve global crises. When evaluated through the U-model, the Paris Agreement scores a 76%. It aggressively targets environmental action, but it lacks the structural form of universal ethical baselines and the position of economic inclusivity. Because it treats the environment in isolation, progress stalls. You cannot sustain long-term action if you ignore the other 2 pillars of stability. A high-scoring U-model system requires simultaneous optimization. An organization must maintain its ethical integrity, optimize its operational efficiency, and meet the expectations of its citizens. Looking at near-future economic applications, this diagnostic metric is positioned to replace traditional ESG frameworks and heavily dictate global stock market valuations. In international relations, countries will be evaluated by their measurable track record of reducing systemic decay, rather than relying strictly on raw GDP numbers. This shift toward triadic measurement is a structural requirement forced by the economy of three resistances. It represents the minimum price any civilization must pay to resist its own internal entropy. Human civilization is colliding with a strict structural law. We will either learn to speak the native grammar of form, position, and action, or our fragmented systems will simply collapse under their